Sometimes sleeps.
Okay, so. It takes a while to get everything moving in the morning. So, we are all leaders in our various traditions. And I'm going to just start moving up and down the road. So the first question for everyone is to name your tradition, where it came from, how you got into it, and who you worship. Rob.
You know, these are lightning round questions because we only have a little bit of time per question, but Urglaawe originates and emanates from the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, the living Pennsylvania Dutch culture. We are very fortunate to have an heirloom practice called Braucherij, also known as Hexerij in some parts of the state, which is the healing and magical traditional practice that has at its core a heathen core. And so when stripping away the Christian and Gnostic overlays, we end up with this heathen center that we can actually focus on, and that is where Urglaawe springs from. So that is where our tradition originates from. It is a living tradition that has taken root here in the United States and in Canada also. We have pretty active people up in Ontario also. And so we're very fortunate that our ancestors preserved that stuff for as long as they did. So.
And you're born into it.
And born into it, yes.
Family triad, guys.
Family and cultural triad.
And who are your deities?
Our deities are the Germanic deities. We differ slightly from the Norse in the way that we perceive them, but also in kind of who's in charge, because the head of our pantheon is a goddess. It's the goddess Hola. And so there are differences, but plenty of similarities that you could go to an Urglaawe ceremony and, you know, having attended Asatru ceremonies, and you feel perfectly comfortable. So.
Okay.
Next.
Yes. And you need to be closer to the mic.
Okay.
The tradition that I practice is called Philadech. It's an Irish word that means the craft of poetry. Sorry, can you hear me in the back of the room?
What's your name?
My name is Erynn, Laurie. I practice a tradition that is called Philadech, the craft of poetry. But in Celtic societies, a poet was not just someone who wrote poems, but there was a large social tradition of magic, healing, social commentary surrounding this. It is within a larger movement that is called Celtic Reconstruction. We are attempting to go back to what the pre-Christian people were doing in the various Celtic nations, but when Christianity arrived, most of that was destroyed. So because the spiritual leaders of the people discouraged writing of sacred things, it can be very difficult to dig through to find out what people were actually doing. As Reconstructionists, we're not interested in living in the past. We don't want to resurrect those things that we know about it, like chattel slavery. You know, it's just, we want to bring forward the ideals that are positive, that are healing and healthy, and reconnect us to the deities and to the land where we live, but also to the land of the ancestors who have inspired us. How I got involved is probably, I think, how a lot of people get involved with various pagan paths. One day, deity walks up and smacks you in the head, and you hear a myth or a poem or a story, and are inspired by something in that. It sparks something within you and calls you to a deeper exploration. Who we worship, the deities of various Celtic cultures, depending. My personal deities are primarily Irish deities. Brigid, who is a goddess of poetry and smithcraft and healing. but also Mananan Maklir, who is a god of the sea and of the mist. He rules the gates between the worlds. Agma, who is a deity of writing and eloquence, because even though the spiritual leaders didn't write anything down that was important, there was an alphabetic system which was possibly used for divination. So I worship these deities, but I also worship my ancestors, both the ancestors of my physical body, but also spiritual ancestors people who have inspired me. And I'm also an animist, and therefore I give reverence to the spirits of the land, to the mountains and the rivers, to the animals and the birds, and to all that lives and all that is.
You're going to find some themes emerging here, and as Erynn just said, the same is for the Germanic peoples, that the pillars of the religious faith are deities, and one of the names for the tradition is Asatru, which is the faith or being true to the Aesir, the Norse gods. The ancestors, and that means your ancestors, whoever they may be, not just your white ancestors, and the Landvættir, the spirits of the land. Those are the three pillars that we rest on. The major gods that we work with, many have probably heard of Thor. The Marvel comic Thor is not exactly the aspect that we work with, but you'll note that both in the movies and in our practice, he is the great defender. Odin is the one who smacked me on the side of the head and said that if I wanted to learn Northern European practices, that he would teach me. I didn't know I was starting a relationship. That's the way it goes sometimes. I got into it because of that encounter. I had already been practicing polytheism for quite some time. Just as there are many Celtic countries and they all have little differences, there are many Germanic countries, and so what we get from continental Germany is similar and overlaps, but it's not always quite the same thing as we get from Scandinavia, and then the Icelanders went and developed it even further, so we can draw from all those sources. And Sheva.
Shalom everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Hello. My name is Sheva. My tradition in Hebrew is called Am Haaretz, which means people of the land. Hicks, country people, you name it. For short, Amcha, which is a derisive term that the rabbis used to mean the people who held on to older earth-oriented beliefs, which is a story that a lot of people on this table can tell. The origin of the tradition are, well, surprisingly common in the Israeli society of my day and before me, and still today. There is an overlap that's quite substantial. But the core places would be the kibbutz, which are voluntary agricultural collectives, and branches of the military, which, unlike what people expect here, are very secular and humanistic and oriented, and not at all the kind of cliche military that people think of. Women are drafted in Israel, so that's where I picked that up. I was raised in a kibbutz, in Kibbutz Adimit on the Lebanese border, and drafted and spent a good number of years doing that. The gods that we revere are the gods that the ancient Hebrews had before rabbinical monotheism. And I know people are often surprised when I say this, but there is a ton of archaeology and literature evidence for that, and this pertains to a later question, so I'm not going to go into that. The main gods are El, the father god, who is kind and you cannot make angry. He's not the smiting god. Yah, who I obviously, out of respect, shorten his name. You all know who he is, Yud He Vav He, who is actually very, very similar to the Canaanite Baal. Baal is not a name, it's a title, it means Lord. And he was a weather god and a war god in the very early times, as behooves the people who were semi-nomadic and were traipsing around the desert and stealing everybody's sheep and doing other very heroic things of this kind, right? We have female goddesses. Asherah is the tree goddess. She's associated as a consort of El. You go to her when you want to ask El for something, because that's how it goes. And there is a goddess, Anat, which has two faces. One is a warrior goddess, and we don't mess with her much. She is a very fearsome goddess in that aspect. And the other one is a more maiden, young woman, wifely, loving. She was considered to be, in Canaanite tradition, the twin sister of Baal, who got Baal out of trouble several times in battle. And in the Hebrew version, she is both these things as well. We have evidence for her having been the consort of Yah in early times for the ancient Hebrews. Sources, very simple. The Hebrew Bible, when you peel back, oh, I'm sorry, wrong question.
Herding cats.
Yeah, sorry. And I think that's it, right, for now? Okay, good. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kirk Thomas. Urglaawe means roughly our own druidry, our own fellowship. Some even say our own magic. Erynn can probably correct me on that. We formed because Isaac Bonowitz, who was a member of the Reformed Druids of North America, failed in his attempt to make it an overtly neo-pagan group. So he left and founded ADF in 1983. What he discovered, and I have to say this here instead of number two, what he discovered is that he thought at that time that there simply wasn't enough information out there to establish an entire religion based on the Irish sources. So he expanded ADF to include the entire Indo-European pre-Christian spectrum, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic. So what we are essentially is a collection of religions. Let's see, how I got into it. I was into witchcraft back in the 1960s. I'm old. And sort of gave it up when I went to college, you know, how these things are, and I didn't do anything about it until 1999, when a friend gave me a novel, a silly little novel called The Mists of Avalon. What it did is it reminded me, I know, darling. She wrote it.
Well, no, I didn't write it.
Well, but you helped. And what it did is it reminded me about how I felt back in the 60s, the wonder and the joy that was with that I had lost. So I thought, well, heck, I'll go back. We'll do this again. Of course, we now had this wonderful thing called the internet, so it was a lot easier to do the research than it was in the 1960s in Oklahoma City. And so I kept running across this ADF website that talked about scholarship and all the gods and everything, and it just really turned me on. And then I found out there was a tiny little group in Tucson, where I was living at the time, for ADF, so I joined on the spot. And I haven't looked back. And so who do we worship? Well, it depends on what heart culture you're a member of. If you're Irish, you worship the Irish gods. If you follow the Roman pantheon, you worship Roman gods. If you follow the Vedic, you follow the Vedic gods. I mean, you see, it depends. And many of us are called, as I am, to a variety of gods and a variety of pantheons. We don't mix them in a single ritual as a rule, because that would be impolite, and some of them may not get along with each other anyway. But it's possible to do many rituals with many different pantheons and many gods. Your turn, Laurie.
I'm Gwendolyn Reece. I am an Hellenic pagan, which is also sometimes called Hellenismos. And so the origin is the ancient pre-Christian religions of Greece. I personally believe that I am a reincarnated ancient Erynn and that I was Greek over and over and over again. And in fact, I make absolutely no sense to myself without reincarnation. I just don't. And so I do want to point out that the belief in reincarnation is a part of a number of the Hellenic religions, including things like the Orphic mysteries. So there is actually an ancient part that goes along with that. I worship and love the ancient Hellenic gods, including but not limited to the Dodecathioi, which are the 12 Olympians, but then there's also a host, anyone who has ever studied any of this, there's a host of other Hellenic gods as well. I am specifically a priestess of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Apollon, the god of light, Apollo. And light in the Hellenic tradition is truth with a capital T, hence the reason that he is the prophetic god. As far as how I got into this, in this life, I began worshiping, talking to, and listening to the goddess Artemis when I was in early grade school. And there is absolutely nothing in my family or cultural background that would even put this on the radar as a possibility. So again, I make no sense to myself without reincarnation. And then it was much later when I discovered that there were other people like me. So I actually kind of got into paganism through these relationships that I believe that I brought into this life, sacred relationships with the Hellenic great ones, and I can't imagine being without them. Imagine being without them, my heart is.
Okay, in a minute, Gwendolyn, I'm going to ask you to take the next question, but I want to point out that some of the themes we're seeing here are polytheism, many gods, ancestors, working with ancestors, or some are called by ancestry, some are called by affinity. And whether that affinity is the result of reincarnation or natural tendencies, or the gods just went shopping, I don't know. And something else that I think is important to all of us is that connection with the spirits of the land on which we live. A lot of our peoples have migrated around from time to time.
I've migrated around.
Yeah, so have we. So, Gwendolyn, would you like to talk about sources of information for doing this?
Sure. So to me, religion is all about the relationships, specifically about the great ones, and as the great ones, we're talking about as real beings. And so from my perspective, all of the